Thank you very much, Gareth. The trouble with these, I always find these things fascinating, but you end up with more questions than answers. Like, what do square-ended eggs do to hens? You know, do you have cross-eyed hens? It sounded painful, and I'd love to see the operating instructions for your umbrella chair. Please ensure your umbrella chair is fully erected before sitting down, especially if you still adopt the 80s fashion of having the arse hanging out your trousers. Without a word of a lie, I once saw a kid skateboarding down a street in Aberdeen, and you could see daylight between the crotch of his pants and the top of his belt. And I thought, how do you keep that up? You know, do they staple it to the side of the legs? How is it physically possible? Anyway, I leave you with these questions apropos of nothing. I'm gonna chance my arm here. David Sibbald, Chief Executive Officer of Aridhia Informatics. You quite happy with CEO? Just checking. I'll just read what's put in front of me. And David's going to put the personal take on the entrepreneurial journey. Very much startup focused again. So David, ladies and gentlemen, David Sibbald.
Great, thank you, Mark. Afternoon, everyone. Nice to see so many people, and thanks to Sherry and Gareth for two fascinating talks. I know I should have negotiated to go on first, but there we go. What I'd like to do, kind of over the next 15, 20 minutes, is just talk about three things. One is a sort of a bit of a personal journey from an entrepreneurial point of view. Very unusual for a middle-aged man from Glasgow to want to pour his heart out to somebody, but I want to kind of reflect on sort of 23 years as a software entrepreneur across 3 startup companies. So I'd like to do that. I'd like to talk a little bit about Aridhia, not because I want to make a sales pitch for it, but I kind of want to kind of reflect a little bit about the sort of changes that are emerging within healthcare and medicine as a marketplace, if you like, or as a vertical industry that to a large extent has sort of missed out on the digital revolution, but is sort of coming into it pretty much at full speed. So I'd like to chat about that a little bit, and then kind of wrap up with just a couple of reflections on Scotland and and the opportunities that we've got within our own country. So my journey is 23 years and counting across 3 startups. So literally, clean sheets of paper, first 2 in my spare bedroom, the third one in an office, so we're obviously, moving up in the world. About 28 million pounds in external investment across those 3 businesses, and about 120 million pounds exited to date across those businesses. And I think they're all B2B businesses, so there's a slight change on the conversation that Gareth and Sherry had earlier on. So some of the dynamics associated with that are a little bit different. My background is, I started work in the early 80s. And you're saying that can't possibly be true. You couldn't have started work at 12 years old. But I started work in the early 80s as a software developer, and I still think of that as my trade. Much to the uncontrolled hilarity of everyone in the company. I wasn't a great software developer, so I made the switch over to the dark side from a marketing point of view, and was a kind of reasonably okay product manager, product marketing person. The thing that I think I'd kind of point out, there's a couple of themes within my companies and my experiences, is all of them have happened at a sort of point of transformation within their respective markets. That's quite important, and I think that's quite a kind of common theme. And so to look at that with Atlantic, this was kind of in the early 90s, just as as Gareth was saying, just as the internet sort of arrived on our shores. Well, actually, kind of sort of mid 90s, it might surprise you, but actually the UK was probably furthest ahead in the world in terms of experimentation with sort of very high-speed broadband internet and IP services. And so one of the things that happened is, as network operators and telcos and ISPs all kind of got bigger and started to think about what those services would be, there was kind of an immediate realization that their network fabric that they delivered their services from, historically largely telephony, now into something different, was very different. And the ability to actually provision across a different network architecture those different services and tie them into kind of legacy billing systems was something that was missing. So there was a big gap there. And we were fortunate enough to, to kind of talk our way in to participation in a lot of those early trials. And through that, we learned enough and experienced enough and did enough hard yards to basically build a provisioning environment for those services that really talked to a very different network fabric than had existed previously. And so we did that, we built that, we kind of got ahead of the market on that. We got chased very rapidly by some very big industry players, and eventually we sold the business to Cisco in sort of 2000. Sumerian, shortly after, again, the sort of change that happens there is kind of following, to some extent, the whole dot-com crash and that kind of wipeout. The emergence of kind of virtualization as a technology initially on sort of computing platforms, but then migrating into storage, migrating into the network itself. That whole notion of how people could actually virtualize that environment as a sort of shared infrastructure and run lots of different services and lots of different applications on top of that, that was kind of a transformational change that is still happening to a large extent. Again, from our point of view, the opportunity there is if you're running 100 different applications or services on a sort of shared virtualized environment, how do you know what capacity you're supposed to put in place to make those function in the way that they're supposed to function? So again, transformational change in the market. How do we get in there quite quickly, start to work with initial customers and sort of really make that successful? And so Sumerian grew rapidly in its first few years, slammed up against a wall with a financial crash because pretty much 100% of our customers were in sort of financial services. So that chaos of sort of 2007, 2008 ensued. But enormous credit to the team and the company. They fought their way through that, and right now, coming out the other side of that, have absolutely the best product in the market for really understanding how to sort of predict capacity and usage across sort of very vast virtualized estates. And last company, Aridhia, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that at the end, but when I started Aridhia, as I said, I think that whole market of medicine and market of healthcare sort of really, the digital revolution has sort of passed it by for a lot of different reasons, but it has passed it by. But actually, the economics of healthcare, whether it's the NHS in the UK, whether it's private healthcare in the US, whether it's hybrid models in the rest of Europe, the sheer economics of supply and demand is not a pretty picture. So something has to change. Things have to change. And so there's a lot of kind of advances and changes within that market, and I'll talk about a little bit later on, that sort of really make that sort of a very, very attractive opportunity from our perspective. So I'd say within all of these, the other common characteristic is, I'm kind of all in on them all. So I've been the founding CEO in every company. First 4 years in Sumerian, all of Atlantic, all of Aridhia, and it's kind of got a couple of lessons learned, across these 23 years that I want to play back to everybody. But that level of commitment is really important. So the intensity and the energy that gets put into actually making something start from nothing to something is a really important thing. It's quite hard to measure. First dance. Yep. Still waiting. It's very hard. It's very hard to measure, but it's very, very important. So that level of commitment is key. I certainly, from a personal perspective, if things go well, that's great. If things go not so well, or not well at all, I certainly wouldn't want to be looking at myself in the mirror saying, should have tried harder, should have worked harder. So that level of intensity is pretty important. The other characteristic is that everything that we've done across all those three companies sort of sits on this piece of the seesaw. It's hard, but it's not impossible. So we're not trying to, we're not trying to land a craft on Mars. But equally, we're not just trying to replicate something that already exists within an existing market or a mature market. We're not just trying to build a slightly better mousetrap. We're trying to do something that is meaningful, is tricky to do, and to a large extent is actually best done by a startup entrepreneurial team. Because when you look at some of those hard problems, it's actually quite difficult for larger companies to actually get that level of energy and intensity to solve some of those large problems. It's just too hard. In theory, they can do it. In practice, never really works that way. So everything that we've done has really kind of been sort of focused on this part of the spectrum. In terms of my experience, this is a kind of quite a famous graph. Anyone that's worked with me in the audience will sigh when they see it. And it was produced by two Japanese academics, about over a decade ago, actually. But it's very, very relevant. It's very relevant, I think, to a lot of entrepreneurial businesses. It's certainly very relevant to the three businesses that I've started, and it really reflects this, this journey. You sort of start off on the left-hand side. And it's a very small group of people, 2 people, 3 people, maybe 4 people. You're in a small office, you're in a bedroom, you're in somebody's lounge, whatever. But it's just about, it's about ideas and sort of dreaming what things could be. And it's fantastic. There's incredible energy there. There's passion, there's kind of creativity. It's not costing you any money. There's lots of things drawn on whiteboards and stickers, and it's just great. Okay, so that's fantastic. Once you get to that point of actually sort of committing and moving towards the right-hand side of the graph, there's a lot of work on, what's the product, what's the service, what's the architecture, what's the technology, what do we need to do this, how long is it going to take, how much it's going to cost, all that stuff. What's our business model going to be, who are our customers going to be? So you kind of wander across there, you get to the point where there's the inevitable chase for that first customer. When you realize you sort of run out of steam of trying to figure all this stuff out by yourselves, and you say, we've got to talk to the market, whatever that means, okay? And it's quite difficult sometimes to figure out what that market is, and so what you say is, we're going to talk to a customer, we're going to get our anchor customer, our first customer, and we're going to go and work with them. And then, again, my experience, you get confused slightly between what a customer wants and what a market wants. They may be the same thing, but pretty much they're different things. Individual customers are unique, certainly in the sort of B2B world. They've got their own challenges, their own problems, their own timelines, their own things they need to resolve. But you kind of get that first customer, and then the real big push is, how do we get product launched into the market? How do we do that? Everybody's running faster and faster and faster. You're bringing extra people onto the team. So that real tight integration between 2, 3, 4 people now maybe has 10 people or 12 people. And it's kind of not quite as slick as it was. And so things become a bit inefficient for a while until they get back to efficiency. But actually by this time you're sort of spending some more money. You get that first product launched. Actually, it's not really time to launch that first product, but it's launched. And so we actually need what we need is a second iteration of that. Maybe we need a third iteration of that, because we're finding more and more from the market, and we're finding more and more in what our technology stack can do, can't do, should do, doesn't do, et cetera, et cetera. So we do that. And then we sort of we get that right, and then we fall into this, this kind of great expression of the valley of death. And you've sort of really got to get out of the valley of death as quickly as you possibly can. So the whole point of this journey here is you need to get from the left-hand side to the right-hand side as quickly as you possibly can, and you need to do it while kind of staying alive, and you need to do it by building a kind of solid bridge across there. So you want something that looks like the Forth Road Bridge. You don't want something that looks like some rope and some bits of wood across the Mekong River. Okay, so you've really got to try and build that stability in there if you're ultimately going to scale that business. So I found this, this kind of pictorial really helpful for me over the last decade or so. And I think some of the lessons that I kind of wanted to sort of share in sort of my journey with you that I hope will be helpful, because at one hand, I sort of was looking at the slides earlier on and I thought, those are a bit generic, but actually they are, but they're quite true. I mean, these are things that I kind of wish I'd spent a little bit more time on and continue to wish I spend more time on a sort of day-to-day basis. But I think it's all about trying to get to, from one side of that graph to the other as quickly as you can. And the first is a business model. So, from a startup point of view, my experience has been we spend a huge amount of time on our product, as we should. And so what is it? What does it do? Features, functionality, architecture, tech choices. How are we going to do that? How are we going to build this? How's it going to work? What's the development process internally? So we really fixate on that product. And you need to fixate on that product. That's important. But it's not the same as fixating on your business model. And this is kind of one of the, Gareth's point about that sort of truth curve. The truth will be out at some point when that product gets out of your shop and gets into the market. Because truth be told, a customer doesn't really care so much about all of that. The thing they care about is how does that product turn itself into a service that fits into my very complex environment and my 101 list of things to do that sort of have to be done yesterday. So the business model about how do you sell this and how does it align with your customer's environment and what dependencies do you have on your customer from adopting your product and service, and do you really understand what those are? And can you take those and engineer them into your product to make the friction point to adoption easier and easier and easier and easier? So I know so I'm obsessed with business model now, but I never used to be obsessed with business model. I used to be obsessed with product. And I think this is something that we generally do. I talk to a lot of kind of early stage companies and startups, and again, rightly, everyone's very fixated on the product, but kind of less about actually what is the business model that's going to get this into the market and allow you to sort of scale in a repeatable fashion. That's pretty important. The other one, this has come up. It's come up a couple of times, both with Sherry and with Gareth. So I describe myself as a realistic optimist, but I am a recovering optimist. Okay, so this it's quite subtle, this, in many respects. It sort of ties back into the team of people that are trying to do the work. But if you're at the start of a company where you have nothing but a clean sheet of paper, you have to be an optimist, because if you're not, you just won't make that step, because everything is just too daunting. The challenges are too, if you sort of do a rational analysis of everything, you say, actually, the uncertainty is too high, so we just can't make that step. So you have to be an optimist. But as we know in life, often too much of a good thing ends up being a bad thing. And so how do we sort of keep that optimism, but sort of pull back from it a little bit? How do we get the dynamics of the team around us to the point where we've really got a blend of people who are right across that spectrum, highly optimistic all the way through to, slightly pessimistic? How do you get that? How do you get that blend there, and how do you actually get it to work without being destructive? So spending time thinking about that, and it's a bit of introspection. It's not, again, not something necessarily you can sort of measure, but something I think is very, very important as you go through that journey. The other one is time and money, and my experience and companies I have and the markets I play in, you always need more time and you always need more money. And so, again, thinking about that, which I think ties to the business model and actually ties to the sort of optimism, realism piece. How do you get as precise as you possibly can be about the time and as precise as you possibly can be about the money? And it's an easy thing to say, and it's an intuitive thing because everyone nods their head and says, yep, that's what you're supposed to do. But it's quite a hard thing to do. And it's a part of our job as sort of entrepreneurs, sort of a bit counterintuitive, but actually is about chipping away at risk every day. So every day we've got to try and chip away at that risk. And that's a 1,000-cut job. It's not one or two, and we sort of reduce our risk profile in half. There's technology risk, there's people risk, there's customer risk, there's money risk. There's risk everywhere. And we just sort of chip away at it and chip away at it and chip away at it. And through that process, try and get as accurate as we can about what the time is and what the money is. And that's different in kind of different markets. If you're in a B2C market, it's different than a B2B market. If you're in an existing marketplace that's well understood and established, it's different from something that is transformational or emerging. And so particularly in sort of emerging markets where the future isn't quite written and the map isn't quite drawn, it's quite difficult to do. But I'm trying to put as much time into thinking about time and money is pretty important. And the last thing obviously is, it's kind of like an obvious one here is, what is the team? What is the team for this journey? Because really what you need if you're going to get from one side to the other and really build a successful global business is you need a team of extraordinary people in their own right, but extraordinary people who actually can work together as a team. And again, that's a kind of an easy thing to say, but it's a hard thing to do because the emotional roller coaster that you go through in this is very emotional and very much a roller coaster. And different people have different tolerances as to how much of that they can take. And you've got to think about that as the team comes together. So how do you work to get those team dynamics better and better and better? How do you get team members to excel in their own particular area, but actually always be available for a pass from somebody else? We all have up days, down days, good days, bad days. How does the team connect with each other and sort of play that supportive role as well as deliver excellence within their own function? So, as I've thought about my own personal experience, and I think it sort of comes down to those things. Some of those things you can be quite kind of measured and purposeful about just almost process that makes it better and better and better. And some of it is really about, sort of emotional connection with other people in your team and your own understanding and awareness of yourself, from a strengths, a weaknesses, a likes and a dislikes point of view. And some of those softer things, which I have to, in my, kind of getting old now, but, in my earlier years, I used to just completely disregard those. But actually, the older I get and slightly wiser I get, the more important I think those softer things are to really building companies of sustainability, whatever your marketplace is. I did want to talk a little bit about not so much Aridhia, although there is a little bit about Aridhia in this, but really about sort of healthcare and that sort of potential kind of data, digital revolution sort of coming into medicine and healthcare. So, there was a really interesting paper that was put out in 2011 by the World Economic Forum, which is kind of one of those numbers you look at that just is insane. But basically, the sort of summary of this paper was that within healthcare globally, if there's a continued rise in chronic disease, cancer, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, all those sort of non-communicable chronic diseases, the continued rise in that associated with the demographic profile that we've got, and if things basically stay the way they are within healthcare, to meet that demand is going to consume 75% of the world's GDP. I mean, it's just mental. I mean, it's just a crazy number. I mean, so we, in the UK right now, we spend about 9% of GDP on health. In the US, it's nearly double that. It's about, it's just under 20%, just under 20%. But 75%, that can't be true. I mean, and if it is even almost true, we're all bankrupt. And so what is the answer to that? And there isn't a single answer, but this is a big, big, big problem. And data and analytics and the ability to get evidence-based into how both individual patients and populations are managed and treated and diagnosed across those chronic conditions becomes really, really important. So in Aridhia, what we've done, is we've tried to look at that problem, but we've realized that, medicine is a really complicated subject, and provision of healthcare is a really complicated subject. So as part of our building of the company, we brought the university in as a shareholder, we brought the NHS in as a shareholder, so that we would basically embed that deep scientific and clinical and medical and healthcare expertise in the company, because we thought we needed to have that domain expertise sitting in the desk beside our development guys and our data science guys to actually have a go at making this all work. So this notion of collaboration from a sort of academic, public and private sort of joint venture is really the sort of model that we've set up for the company. And that makes it very, very challenging to work with, because if you're an entrepreneur, you think like an entrepreneur, you behave like an entrepreneur, you act like an entrepreneur. If you're an academic, that's for the most part different. If you're somebody who's grown up and spent 25, 35 years in the NHS, that's very, very different. And so this notion of how do you bring those different cultures together in a team and actually get it to function is quite a challenge. But that's what we've tried to do. We've built a collaborative data science platform that allows people to, in a highly secure way, bring their data together, help them build data sets that are relevant to particular hypotheses or problems they're trying to solve, run their analytics, get clinically validated answers out of that, and then sort of distribute that through a very sort of modern app framework. So combination of all the kind of cloud computing technologies that we sort of know and love, the data science needs, and the sort of agile ability in terms of sort of app development and distribution. And so there's two areas to that. One is healthcare today, how things are working right now. This is kind of an example of that. So this is taking a clinically validated algorithm that got written by the Nuffield Trust that basically, looks at risk of patient readmission into secondary care within 30 days of discharge. So the NHS in England, have fined all the trusts in England about £400 million over the last 4 years because people who have come in either through A&E or come in from an elective procedure have left and have bounced straight back into hospital again, which just causes utter chaos, right? You just think of the kind of knock-on effects of that. So the Nuffield developed an algorithm, clinically validated that algorithm, in essence through a clinical trials process, but it kind of sat there. And so what we've done is, we've partnered with them, we've worked with them, we've developed that, which defines a data set that people can fire in at the bottom side of the algorithm, run the algorithm, give you the results over tablet, phones, desktop, whatever. That's getting, made available on a kind of freemium service across England, and sort of incremental sort of upgrade service that's a little bit paid for. So actually, it's almost the start of some of the B2B activities that go on here into something that looks a little bit more like B2C. So we have a lot of these things that we're doing about joining data together for care of diabetes, care of cancer, linking those data together in terms of individual patient pathways and really sort of optimizing the journey of care for people with individual chronic conditions. And we're doing that at scale in terms of number of patients. So that's kind of interesting today. The sort of direction of travel for medicine is really how do you take this solid cancer tumor and turn it into something that is basically a big data file that's available for analysis and clinical interpretation. Okay, and so this is absolutely the direction of travel right now. So we've got in England, we have the 100,000 patients who are being whole genome sequenced through the NHS. And so this is again a great transformation that's taken place in sequencing costs. So if you look at the cost of genomic sequencing, it's actually got a more rapid fall in terms of price performance than Moore's law. And so we get to this thing that we sort of all hear about sort of $1,000 genome, and the path for that is pretty clear. The challenge after that is actually the clinical interpretation and analysis of that data combined with historic patient data, how that gets merged together, how that gets interpreted, and how that gets delivered basically into the clinic. Okay, and that is a journey. That's a journey that's probably still got 3 to 5 years to run before it actually reaches sort of maturity and sort of everyday practice. This stuff is really important. This is absolutely the direction of travel. And the goal here is how do we get from one-size-fits-all medicine, which is largely what we've got today. So again, for a lot of those chronic conditions, trial and error medicine. The symptoms and the diagnosis can be done pretty accurately. The therapeutic pathway that a patient goes on either has an impact, doesn't have an impact, or has an adverse event. And it is a trial and error, because we're not quite sure, because everybody behaves in a different way as individuals. So how do you get from that on the left-hand side to basically something that is much more predictive and much more precise medicine, a lot of which will be driven by data and analytics. But it has to be driven in a highly collaborative, multidisciplinary way. So almost impossible, no matter how many brilliant data, computer scientists, software development people we could get, doesn't matter, we wouldn't be able to solve this problem. We need to get those folk, but we need to join them together with the academic research community, and we need to join them together with the clinical community. So we're fortunate to be part of the Genomic England program that is basically looking at what are the things we need to do to industrialize this process that takes us to precision medicine based on molecular diagnosis and analysis into the clinic on a patient-by-patient basis. So that's the kind of second piece of kind of our journey, but I'd say this is back to the sort of entrepreneurial sort of experiences. It's about how do we look at that problem and how do we look at that opportunity and what is it we need to bring together to actually give us a chance of solving that? What do we need to do? And in our case, it has been to think differently about the structure of the company. So in essence, it looks more like, sort of public-private joint venture, because certainly in our analysis, that's what it is going to take to actually solve that problem. So kind of wanted to touch a little bit on that because I think it is important, and I think actually thinking a little bit on the last bit before I wrap up on Scotland, this is an area where Scotland can be great, because I think all of those next big challenges like that, the value is solved in the margins between disciplines of different people working together. It's not a pure software problem or a pure computing science problem or a pure app problem. You know, it really is a collaborative engagement to solve something that's pretty tricky. So in Scotland, I think we're good at that, and I think we could be great at that. And I think that it's very difficult for other places to actually do this type of thing. So I was over we took 2 trips back and forward to the US in the last sort of 3 months, basically on a should we, shouldn't we try to do something in the US. And actually when you go around both the hospitals and the academic health science facilities there, which are truly excellent, actually there's just a structural problem that exists in the way that it's set up in the US, where people are not incented in any way, shape or form to collaborate with each other. They're actually incented to compete with each other. I mean, it's so dysfunctional, you couldn't make it up. But actually, I think that's a barrier to the US being dominant and being successful in this area. So when we talk about areas where Europe can be really successful and kind of closer to home, where Scotland can be really successful, I think it's in these types of areas. Because I do think we do collaboration well. We're small, everybody knows everybody. You know, it's pretty easy to get connected to who you need to get connected to. And people do want to work together. So I do think we're good at that, and I think we could be great at that. Sherry put up some numbers earlier on about open vacancies and SMET skills shortages. Again, you know, we've got the second largest informatics school, you know, on our doorstep here. Stanford number 1, Edinburgh number 2. And we've all got a lot of those kids, young adults coming out of there into our companies. I mean, they're exceptionally talented. You know, as somebody who's run a software development facility in the US, in Silicon Valley, that ability to hire and sustain a team for a long journey that some of these things take is nigh on impossible, but it's not nigh on impossible in Scotland. So I don't think we should ever underdo ourselves in terms of what is possible sort of locally in our own country. Kind of last slide is there actually a fourth. I wanted to leave this with you, mostly because I'm going to ask you to buy something. Happy to sell you a subscription to our platform, but this might be a bit easier. But we've got a fourth company that is actually, it's not a tech company, it's a not-for-profit social enterprise business that's based out in Nairobi, that takes highly disadvantaged kids out of slum areas, puts them through a free apprenticeship scheme, and then provides them a job within our kind of workshops, making jewellery and fashion, both for local sale and for export. All the money goes back into continue to run the business and to fund the education programs for sort of 500 highly disadvantaged kids. And actually a lot of the challenges we talked about, or I talked about earlier on, about teams and optimism, business models, exactly apply to this. So Christmas is coming, okay, and you know, £10, you can buy your kids a t-shirt, or your wife or your partner a necklace, jahari.co.uk. Thanks very much.